Merry Christmas, patrons and metamorphs and all my assorted fans. I'm here with the second part of the Metamor City holiday story that I wrote for you guys this year. This is A Wizard Family Solstice. If you didn't see part one yet, you should go scroll back through the listings, the postings recently in Fans of Metamor City fan group, also on my personal Facebook page, and you will find the first part over there. So if you've listened to that part already, then go ahead and follow along with me as I read part two. Part two, Mother and Child. John's question seemed to snap the two wizards out of their standoff. Artax cleared his throat, begrudgingly stated that they'd all be much more comfortable discussing matters over tea, and then led the way up to the flat he now shared with John. Esme looked around with apparent appreciation as she stepped into the front sitting room. "Oh, this is lovely," she said, taking in the comfortable, overstuffed love seat, the armchairs, the tapestries on the walls, and the coffee table in the middle with its elegant porcelain tea service. "I'm glad to see you've still got the homemaker instinct, at least." Artax grunted and ambled to the adjoining kitchen, where he busied himself with putting the kettle on. "You might as well make yourself comfortable, lass. I'm sure Master Tunstall will have questions." "That's an understatement," John said. Esme perched on one side of the love seat, looking almost feline as she surveyed the room. Her eyes fell on John, and she patted the seat beside her in invitation. John sat in one of the armchairs instead, and Esme shrugged and put her feet up on the sofa, claiming the space. "You called Master Artax mother," John said. "What did you mean?" Esme traced a finger along the tapestry on the wall beside her. "I mean she carried me in her body for 9 months and then pushed me out of her vagina." The bluntness of the words left John momentarily speechless. From the kitchen, John heard Artax grunt again, possibly in amusement, but he added nothing further. "How is that possible?" John said. "I mean, I know he's a master of transformation magic, but I thought if a sex-shifted person got pregnant, the change was permanent." "Your master was my mother, Leah Freebairn, for most of 20 years, Esme said. "I'd say that's fairly permanent, wouldn't you?" John sat back in his chair, feeling dazed. 20 years. I had no idea. "It's not something he likes to advertise," Esme said dryly. "We were living off the grid in those days. We had a little cottage in the Southmoran Highlands. Just me and Mum, a few chickens, 2 nanny goats, a flock of sheep, and a vegetable garden. And the magic, of course. There was always the magic." "So you were his apprentice," John said. "I was her daughter," Esme said, raising her voice a little to pitch it toward Artax in the next room. "I did what daughters do. I learned at my mother's knee. I learned magic because it was what she did, and because I had the talent." She shrugged one shoulder in an almost insolently dismissive gesture. "I thought I was learning how to be a woman, too, but I suppose I was just learning how to pretend to be one." Artax came back into the room with a steaming kettle. He poured the water into the teapot and covered it with the cozy, which looked like a fat, smiling cat. "Give that 5 minutes," he muttered, then walked back into the kitchen. "So why was he there?" John asked. "And who was the father? And why live as a woman for so long? And, for that matter, why did he leave?" Esme snorted and looked up at the ceiling. "Welcome to my set of questions. He won't answer any of them. Gods know why. I particularly wanted an answer to that last one, since I'd just had my 18th birthday when Mother told me the truth about who he was. Now that I was of age, he said, he was going back to Metamor City. He invited me to come along." She shook her head in disbelief. "As if I'd want all this nonsense, when I could have green hills underfoot and blue sky overhead." "And yet here you are," Artax said sardonically, as he came back into the room. He eased himself into the armchair opposite her. Coming home for the holidays at last, Esmeralda." Esme sat up and faced him, giving him her full attention. "If that puts you in a giving mood, then absolutely, let's say that's it. I need your help, Mum." Artax snorted. John noticed that it sounded a lot like when Esme did it. "You've made very clear for the last 20 years that you didn't want or need my help. Why the change of heart now?" Now, at last, the bravado faded from Esme's face and posture. "Because I want a baby," she said. For the second time in an hour, John felt the heat drain out of his face. He said. Artax didn't look impressed. "I hardly think you'd have to come all the way up here and seduce my apprentice for that, my dear." "But that's the trouble, Mum." Esme leaned in and peered at Artax, steepling her fingers in front of her. "I can't get pregnant. I've been trying for 10 years. I've seen every fertility doctor in 3 provinces. I've tried artificial insemination. Nothing. I've had my eggs harvested for in vitro fertilization. None of them took. They've run every test they can think of. Everything comes back normal." Slowly, Artax settled back in his chair. "I see. So you think your trouble has to do with the unusual manner of your conception." Esme spread her hands. "If anyone would know, it would be you. I've tried doing some research on my own, but you know what it's like trying to study yourself with your own magic." John grinned. "Like trying to lick your own elbow," he said. "Exactly." Esme took off the tea cozy and poured cups of tea for herself and Artax. She glanced at John questioningly, but he shook his head. The 2 elder wizards, mother and child, John supposed, raised their teacups to one another, as if in salute, and drank together. "I can't promise anything," Artax said. "My years as Leia were not entirely of my own doing." Something twinkled in his eyes, and a very small smile touched the corners of his lips. "But for you, my dear, I will try." Something softened in Esme's posture. She smiled back, and it looked more genuine than anything else John had yet seen from her. "That's all I ask." Artax let Esme spend the night in the guest room. John couldn't remember the apartment having a guest room when he first moved in, but the shop was like that. It seemed to anticipate the master's needs and prepare for them in advance. Someday, John hoped, Artax would explain all the secrets of spells for you, where the shop had come from, how it moved from place to place, and how it changed to suit his purposes. But John suspected that he was a long way from such revelations. After all, he hadn't even known Artax had a daughter. A knock came at his door while he was getting ready for bed. His heart quickened in anticipation, and he quickly went to the door and opened it. But it was Artax, not Esme. The master must have caught the look of disappointment on his face, because he chuckled in dark amusement. "Might I have a moment of your time, Master Tunstall?" he asked. "If you're not expecting to be otherwise engaged, that is." John bowed his head and opened the door wider. "Of course, master. Please come in." Artax entered the room and sat down in the office chair at John's desk. He glanced briefly at John's homework, a transformation spell he was learning to master, then spun around to face John. John sat down in front of him at the end of the bed. The old man looked briefly down at his hands before speaking. "I should have told you about Esme. I suspected she was in the neighborhood." John frowned. "Suspected? You didn't know?" Artax shook his head. "Esme has the same gift of foresight that I do, but our abilities seem to be neutralized where the other is concerned. Her presence creates a cloud in my perceptions." John made several connections, then. "That's why you weren't feeling well this morning, and why Esme didn't know what would happen after she came to the shop." Artax nodded slowly. He leaned back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling. And it's why I didn't know about her little problem either. One more way I've made things difficult for the lass, I'm afraid." John leaned forward, searching his master's face. "Why did you do it? Going to the Highlands? Living as a woman? What was the point? What were you doing up there?" "Learning," Artax said. "About what?" John persisted. "About being a woman? Raising a kid?" "That," Artax said, "and other things." John spread his hands and gave the old man an expectant look. Artax sighed. "You can't have the answers if you don't know the questions, Master Tunstall. You're too young and too city-bred for any of this to have much meaning to you. There were things from my own past that I needed to reconnect with. There were things I needed to understand about my own mother's life before I could become whole, able to do the work that awaited me here. Our mutual friend understood that." John felt a little shiver. Our mutual friend was their private code for Lord Klepnos, the trickster god. Klepnos had brought John and Artax together nearly 3 years ago, saying that the apprenticeship would be beneficial for them both. In that time, John had learned that Artax was one of the god's agents in the world. Klepnos had found the wizard during a dark and terrible time in his life, and had given him new purpose and direction at a time when he badly needed them. But Klepnos never quite explained why he gave Artax his missions, nor what greater purpose they were supposed to accomplish. Much of the time, Artax was left to figure things out for himself. "I'll need your help to unravel Esme's problem," Artax said, dragging John's thoughts back to the present. "You don't have the same blind spots I have when it comes to my daughter. You may see something I've missed." John nodded. "I'm happy to help, sir." Artax gave him a hard look then. "Just you be careful around her. She's a trickster, as you've seen. This whole business of wanting a child could just be a ploy in some larger game." John considered that. "Well, sir," he said at last, "she is your daughter." Artax's eyes went wide, and he barked a laugh. "True enough, lad, true enough." He pushed himself slowly to his feet and headed for the door. "All right, I'll let you be now. We'll see to this business in the morning." "Good night, sir." Artax shut the door behind him. John lay back on his bed, thinking. Esme did not come to John's room that night, but she featured prominently in his dreams. The next morning John made breakfast for the three of them: eggs, sausage, fried potatoes, and coffee. Esme came to the dinner table fresh from the shower, with a towel wrapped around her head and wearing one of her father's spare robes. The robe only covered her to about mid-thigh, and the sight of her long, shapely legs was very distracting as John carried the food to the table. Whoever she'd gotten her height from, it clearly hadn't been Artax. She looked appreciatively at the spread before them, then turned to the old man. "Helpful, this one, isn't he?" she asked, nodding her head at John. "Master Tunstall has his uses," Artax admitted gruffly. He wasn't a morning person, and John didn't take the surly tone personally. "Are you sure I can't steal him away from you?" Esme asked, casting a mischievous look up at John. "I could do with an apprentice. I imagine I might put him to a few more uses than you do." John blushed, but he also felt a little thrill of victory. So, her attraction to him hadn't just been an act to get past the master's wards. Some of last night's fantasies began to dance through his imagination again. "You're both of age," Artax said dismissively. "Your choices are your own. That said, I would remind you that Master Tunstall and I are currently wanted by the Ministry of Intelligence. Until that business is cleared up, he would be well advised to remain here." The remainder of breakfast was, thankfully, free of any further discussion of their fugitive status. Artax remained mostly silent, except for the occasional grunt, while John asked Esme about her life after her mother's departure.
I went to university in Silvassa, she said. Still too large a city for my taste, but at least it was close to home.
What did you study? John asked. Besides magic, I mean.
Public health, Esme said. Poverty's a great problem in the Highlands, with all that entails. There's a lot of preventable illness.
Artax snorted. Aye, a lot of fools drinking and smoking themselves into an early grave. Esme gave him a sharp look.
Didn't you tell me you were one of those fools once?
Aye, Artax said, unrepentant. And then I made different choices. I didn't need some meddling do-gooder bureaucrat to tell me what was good for me.
John cleared his throat. Well, not everyone has a mutual friend to help them out of a hard spot.
Artax glared daggers at John, but then he harumphed and lowered his eyes to his plate again. I'm just saying, he muttered. A mage with your talents could have been a guild master by now.
Esme reached across the table and put her hand over Artax's. She leaned in closer, trying to look him in the eye. Mum, it's all right. I'm happy with my work. I'm going to live a long time. There's plenty of time to pass on what I've learned. She paused. Besides, I'd prefer to pass it on to my own daughter first, the way you taught me. She squeezed Artax's hand gently. The old man's eyes darted up to hers for a moment. Then he cleared his throat and looked away.
We'd best get moving on addressing your problem, he said. I've had a few thoughts since last night.
After breakfast, they headed down to the laboratory. Artax had a truly astonishing variety of magical instruments, most of which looked like they were cobbled together from used clock parts and old astronomical equipment. Even after 3 years, John still didn't know the functions of more than half the devices. Artax gestured at a round stool under an intricate array of lenses, crystals, and what looked like brass telescopes.
Have a seat, lass.
Esme sat, crossing her legs in a manner that made John imagine her doing the opposite. She placed her hands one atop the other in her lap, then winked at John. John didn't notice Artax giving him instructions until the old man swatted the back of his head.
Focus, boy, he snapped. We have work to do. Now go bring me 3 mana batteries from the back room.
Sorry, master, John said, and went. The mana batteries were enchanted cylinders about 1/2 meter tall, each of which weighed about 20 kilos. Each one could store about as much mana as John could call up in the space of a month. He plugged the batteries into the device in the appropriate locations, which Artax had clearly marked and fitted with one-way couplings to ensure the correct direction of flow. The old man pulled a lever at the back, and the machine whirred to life. The crystals began to glow with a soft pink light, and a humming noise emanated from a spherical brass protrusion at the top of the device. So what does this one do? John asked Artax. The master was now peering through one of the scopes pointed at Esme, adjusting a set of interlocking dials around the eyepiece.
It's a thaumascope, Artax said. It allows detailed examinations of the magic fields around a subject. I'm looking to see if there are any residual enchantments that could be affecting her.
Something she might have inherited from you mean? Artax grunted in the affirmative. He moved to another scope, roughly 90 degrees away from the first, and began adjusting that one as well.
I was under a powerful long-term enchantment when I gave birth to Esme. My body's sperm had been transformed into eggs. Obviously they worked well enough for the purpose. He gestured at Esme as evidence. But the enchantment may have lingered in some way that affected her own reproductive system.
Like maybe her eggs think they're supposed to be sperm, John suggested.
A gross oversimplification of the factors in play, but for the purposes of discussion, I shall say yes, Artax said. Come here. I'll show you how to adjust the scope.
Under the thaumascope, and with his aura sight engaged, Esme's body looked like a swirling, shimmering cacophony of colorful magic fields. John could see the 7 mystic centers, called a malin, which ran from the crown of the skull down to the base of the spine, and which formed the central channel for mana in the body. The brightest of these was in her solar plexus. This was the Amala, where a wizard stored her excess mana for spellcasting. At Artax's direction, he zoomed in on the next Amala down, the sacral center. Life mana coursed through it in a continual stream, circulated out through her lower abdomen and groin, and back into the center again. "What should I be looking for?" John asked.
"Eddies," Artax said. "Discontinuities. Areas cut off from the flow. Anything that looks out of place."
He went back to the other scope and began looking through it. They scanned her for the better part of an hour, examining her body's mana fields from all possible angles. A couple of times John saw something that looked strange to his novice eyes, at which point Artax would stop and look through John's eyepiece. Each time the pattern turned out to be unrelated to the enchantments they were looking for. At last Artax pushed up his scope and stepped back, making a disgusted noise. Esme, who had sat quietly in some sort of trance state through the entire examination, now raised her arms over her head and stretched. "No luck?" she asked.
"Not yet," Artax admitted. "But we're a long way from giving up. Come along, we'll try something else."
As it happened, they tried a great many something elses that day. John followed Artax obediently from one experiment to the next, helping as he was bidden, as they scanned, screened, prodded, and probed at Esme's body, mind, and aura. A dozen hypotheses, each more improbable than the last, were raised, tested, and ultimately rejected. Esme never complained, but John could see the weariness creeping into her eyes and posture, and with it the slow realization that perhaps even Artax, with all his brilliance and all his resources, might not be able to help her. Shortly after 7 in the evening, Artax called a halt to the experiments.
"I need to do some more research," he said.
His voice was low, subdued, and he did not look Esme in the eye.
"You should go get some rest, lass."
Esme put a hand on Artax's shoulder.
"I can help with the research," she offered. "It's a bit early to turn in yet."
Awkwardly, Artax reached up and patted her hand.
"I appreciate the offer, my dear," he said, "but I really need some time to think. Alone."
He paused a moment, then added in a lower voice,
"I'm sorry, lass."
Then he stepped away from her and began a slow, shuffling walk back to the apartment stairs. Esme watched him go, her eyes wide, her jaw twitching with words half-formed and then silenced. Her hand still hung in mid-air where he'd walked away from her. "Hey." John came up beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not enough to crowd her. "You want to go get some dinner? I don't know about you, but I'm starved." Esme closed her eyes and took a deep breath, then slowly let it out, letting her hand fall to her side. A moment later she answered him. "Are you old enough to drink, John?"
"Yes."
"Good. Because a bottle of Southmorton whiskey is calling my name right now." And that's the end of part 2. Come back tomorrow evening and I will read you guys part 3, the conclusion of A Wizard Family Solstice. Thanks for watching, and keep it on the bright side.